So it's live, I think now.
Okay.
So, hello. I'm here with the Eli Harman.
Glad to
who
be
is
here.
Yes, thanks for coming on. And someone I used to keep track of on Facebook and admired his video outage, which he was prodigious back in his day, talking in his truck. And as he was saying to me there before we started, he pretty much said it all then. And he's not sure he has anything more to say, but I'll try to squeeze some nuggets out of him because I'm sure he's got some. And Eli is involved with the proprietarian movement, Kurt Doolittle, and them. But he's always been kind of his own guy as well, and certainly of them all, he is the renowned for being the harshest, and I would say the certainly the least emotional in any sense. Even Kurt, when he's, I don't mean to criticize him at all, but I just think he has a little bit of emotionalism in his opinions that I do not detect in you at all. So, yes. And I wanted to nail him down now to see what he thinks about the way things are going currently and what he thinks might happen in the future. And also for the reason that he's often said something that is near and dear to my heart, in that he believes the future is imperial space paganism, which I also believe wholeheartedly. And one thing that I've always admired about him too, which is another thing you do not find in not just any, you don't just find it in, like, it's not just hard to find, almost nobody thinks this, the importance of space generally, and the idea of that humans should go into space, and really that's the frontier that they must be striving for. And I'd like to talk about that as well. So, Eli, where to start?
Well, we can start with the space or the paganism.
Well, okay, it's paganism then. Yeah. So, what do you? You surprised me there before we started as well to say you were actually getting involved in some pagan stuff, which I did not expect either. I thought you were just. I knew you understood it in a Nietzschean sense as an important thing to have your own genealogical religion. I didn't know that you would find it in yourself to be superstitious and religious enough to actually join a group, but apparently you have. So do tell. Yes, do tell.
Well, paganism is the traditional ancestral religions of Europe, predominantly, is what we would be referring to with that word. But you could, I guess, apply it to other traditions from other regions of the world, other folk religions, so to speak. And the European paganisms all derive kind of from a single source, the Proto-Indo-European tradition and culture and religion, and those Proto-Indo-European values, which center around the quest for personal glory. So it's something that Ricardo Duchesne would call aristocratic individualism, where people are seeking to gain status and gain renown through glorious deeds and make a name for themselves essentially as an individual. It's not a collectivist thing. I mean, it can be collectivist in the sense that those glorious heroic deeds can be in service of collective aims and collective interests. But the reward is a personal reward, personal status and personal glory, personal renown. And that's a big part of Indo-European tradition and Indo-European values and Indo-European religion, is that quest for personal glory. And, even outside of that, for yourself, honoring and glorifying your ancestors who achieved great, heroic, noble things.
Right. So in that sense, you are seeing the mindset as a rational course of action still. So let me ask, have you found anything resembling actual belief within yourself? I'm just curious. This is a matter of personal curiosity.
Well, yeah, I have, of course. Okay. I think of it as something probably somewhat subjective, in the sense that me talking about beliefs is not going to change anybody else's.
Right.
But I can certainly talk about what, I do have some of those beliefs, and I've had some of those experiences of my of my own. And to me, I regard those as more personal. But what I can talk about is what can be measured and what can be understood, intersubjectively or objectively. And I think that's probably more productive to talk about for the most part. Because I mean, and so this is an example of where religious belief can be measurable. And it's not a reference to paganism per se, but it's an example of religious belief being measurable, and religious faith, religious, in a sense, gods, if you want to get down to it. This is one way that gods are measurable. And that is, in the United States, Christians have more children than atheists, and Muslims have more children than Christians. That's a measurable consequence of religious belief in gods. And in that sense, there's at least one way that we can say that gods absolutely are real, in the sense that they work measurable results like that in the world. Now,
yes.
I believe they're real in other ways as well. And I think that you should, if you want to participate in a religion and call yourself an adherent of that religion. But at least in that sense, which is a very narrow sense, we can absolutely say that gods are real. And not only real, but evolutionarily adaptive. And so that believing in gods is an evolutionarily stable strategy, and not believing in gods is an evolutionarily unstable strategy. And therefore, in Kurt's terminology, not existentially possible. Atheism is not existentially possible because it can't persist for more than a few generations in competition with, let's say, a religious belief system that has a commandment to be fruitful and multiply, right?
Right.
Where atheism has, let's say, the theory of evolution, which implicitly commands that, but there's no explicit commandment. There's no one preaching that commandment. In fact, the atheist church is preaching the opposite. The atheist church is preaching antinatalism. The atheist church is preaching, the worst thing you can do for your carbon footprint is have children.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's not an existentially possible belief system. And even if you were to discard that antinatalist cathedral, as Moldbug calls it, right? This superstructure of, let's say, secular religious instruction.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you were to discard that, not having the explicit commandment to be fruitful and multiply is still not probably existentially possible for more than a few generations.
Yes, because you've simply winked out of existence, if nothing else. So that is, leave it to you to really give the bottom line of that. You really summarize it extremely nicely in a very rational way, which is, this is another thing I think we have to acknowledge about ourselves, is that we are, in a sense, sort of Christian, pagan, and atheist. Not really, maybe atheist isn't the word, materialist or something. Darwinist, all at once. As in, we have awareness. You can speak about evolution in a way historic pagans and Christians could not, let's say. So we have that awareness inside us, and we can't give that up either. That kind of materialist rationalism is what the more bona fide purist atheists cling to as they vanish. But that's within us as well. So to look at it as a purely rational sense, like you say, how did you put it? Existential
possibility,
causality, possibility. Yeah, I mean, that is very real. So that's like when an idea affects reality. Like you have an idea or a meme or whatever. It affects biology, and then the biology affects the meme back, and it's a feedback loop that proves the importance of ideas. For people who are so purely materialist, I think that everything biology explains absolutely everything. So what am I saying? Oh, I want to say one other thing there. You like Kurt himself, since I don't want to make this about Kurt, but I'm pretty sure he's a bit more Christian. At least when I spoke with him, I got that sense. What does he think about this paganism specific talk?
He's fine with paganism. He thinks that Christianity and paganism should be the only tolerated religions in Western societies. I'm not 100% sure what his position on atheism is, but I think he would probably see the argument that it's not, long-term sustainable.
Yeah, I think he's got sort of a deist view, or like, a broad, God is the cosmos type view or something, is what I would say. So he can see the practicality. Like when you spoke earlier there of the practicality of believing in gods, you think you obviously believe it's more practical to use the plural gods than one God in that.
Well, I do think it's more practical for a variety of reasons. First of all, because, my own personal experiences with divinity have been somewhat varied. And so the best way to account for that is a multiplicity of gods. And, the other reason is because everybody conceives of gods differently. So even if you're using the same word to refer to, let's say, ostensibly the same God, everybody is going to conceive of what exactly that means pretty differently. Let me give you a concrete example of that. So I actually had a Christian tell me one time, a Christian who claimed to be a white nationalist, but who said that ultimately, his loyalty was to his God and his religion. So that if white people abandoned Christianity and pygmies adopted it, he would have to support the pygmies over the white people.
Right.
But that's kind of insane to me, because even if pygmies adopt his God taken out of his religious book, right, their conception of that God is going to be very different than his. Right. So from their perspective, living in the jungle, building huts out of leaves or whatever, hunting for their food, their ability to conceive of a God is going to lead to a very different internal subjective conception than his life and his history and his experiences, and let's say maybe his biological faculties if they differ substantially, or his personality inclinations, right? So that internal subjective conception of God that they're going to have is going to be very different. So even if the pygmy adopts his religion taken straight from his text, it's going to be a very different religion than what he practices, than what he believes.
Yeah.
And so, in effect, they're going to be worshiping two different gods, even if they use the same word for it.
Yeah.
Even if they draw it from the same text.
Yeah. So like syncretism then is also an evidence that there's that God is, the gods are subjective in how we name and interpret them. And
to
also
an extent, yes.
Need for many, yeah.
They may have an ontic existence of their own, on some plane out there. That's objective, let's say.
And probably not at all anthropomorphic at all. Just
but
kind of like
but as far as we conceive of them and worship them and interact with them, that is colored to a large extent by our subjective experiences and interpretations and background and everything else, right?
Right.
And so what we're going to come up with are different beliefs and different practices oriented around those gods, even if we're trying to, let's say, worship the same God and call it by the same name. We're going to end up coming to different beliefs and different practices. And so, in effect, it's going to be two different gods, or more than two different gods, because you're going to have different groups of people with different conceptions. And it happens even within organized Christianity. You've had several schisms and reformations, right? Where people are like, no, this is not right. It's actually this way. And, they're still drawing from the same book. They're still calling the God by the same name, but they've really come up with very different interpretations and very different practices.
Oh, no. Jehovah's Witnesses and Presbyterians and everything. They're quite different.
Yeah. And that's just that's the problem with a universal religion that tries to draw everybody into it, which is that the more people you draw into it, the more diversity you draw into it, the more diversity of personality, the more diversity of viewpoints, the more diversity of mental ability.
But that wouldn't, you're saying that's the strength of paganism. is that there's a diversity.
So the strength of paganism is that you can accommodate that diversity through having different gods. So,
Right.
Farmers can worship one god, warriors can worship another god, aristocrats can worship another god, right? And so their belief and practice can be, let's say, differentiated and specialized according to their, let's say, needs or ability to understand by calling those gods different names.
And then your own personal god will remain just intact and related to you.
Well, you can worship more than one god, but yes, different social.
I just mean like when the Romans encounter, the Germanic gods and whatever, that didn't change anything from their point of view. It's just like, there's another group of powers in the universe or something.
Right.
Even though they tried to syncretically match them up, it often didn't seem to make sense. But that's kind of another.
They did try to match them up and just say, oh, well, they're worshiping the same gods by different names.
Yeah.
That was one thing they did. But even when it was obviously a different god, they could just incorporate that into their pantheon or be like, well, there's this other god and they worship that god. We worship these gods. And either, they could either adopt that worship of that god or not adopt it, but accommodate it or allow for it.
See, that's where that talk right there, like you and I can look at that historically and think, okay, that's great. I think for the average person, especially someone somewhat raised or steeped in Christianity, that sounds like that's what they would call LARPy, or you're picking and choosing your religion in a kind of the foundation is a bit flimsier compared to what they feel they have, even though that's more ancient and historic way to do things.
Well, certainly that could be a benefit, and it could be a feature or a benefit depending on how you look at it. Right. I think of it as a feature of paganism. So paganism is more adaptable.
Yeah.
It can change over time. It can evolve. Just by, let's say switching the emphasis between different gods, you can really change the religion a lot. Or you can start worshiping new gods, and that can accommodate some new need that you have that you didn't have previously. Or there's any number of other ways that it can evolve. Christianity evolves in the same way, but it evolves slower because it's more dogmatic and it's more universalist. So
that's the flip side of that's what I always consider their strength and their weakness. This, as everything you're saying there, where there's more freedom in paganism to explore. And even like, I can see it on the internet right now. If I make an article from a pagan perspective, I can speculate or say whatever I like about anything, and it's fine. If I do it from a Christian perspective, where there's Christians that read it, they're like, no, this is wrong. You can't say this. There's a strict boundary for them.
Well,
not allowed to cross. But that's also their strength in the sense, the dogmatism, obviously, because they have that inside them, that fear of transgressing, which they'll take to the point of even martyrdom and war. So that's a great, because it's based on fear. That's a great strategy in Christianity.
Well, I don't totally agree with you there that it leads to kind of an anything goes kind of situation. Because you can still apply critical methods. It's just like with science. Science is falsificationist. So you're approaching the truth through conjecture and refutation. And you're not proving anything through inductive means or any other means with science, right? You're just falsifying truth candidates. And the hope is that what's left is more true than what you started with.
Right.
So it's a methodology for moving towards the truth, but you can never actually be sure that you've got there. You can apply the same methods to religion. So it's not the case that anything goes. It is the case that religious belief can change and evolve over time, let's say to suit changing circumstances or new discoveries, anything like that. But you can still falsify beliefs.
Right.
Even in a religious context, somebody can believe something that's obviously and totally false, that's disprovable by any number of means.
Right.
It could be textually false. It could be inconsistent with, whatever body of text you're resorting to. It could be inconsistent with the other values of the system. It could be inconsistent with observable reality. Now, again, in some religions, that's a feature. They want people to believe crazy things, obviously false things, demonstrably false things, as a test of faith, to weed out the lukewarm free riders, so they only get the zealots, right?
Yeah.
In some religious systems, that's a feature, but in paganism, it is more consistent with science and with the scientific method, in the sense that you can falsify beliefs and you can make a critical argument like, no, this belief is false, it's wrong, it's not evolutionarily stable or whatever. You can make a critical argument, and we're going to rule that out. That's
Right.
not right.
Because essentially there's no 10 commandments type thing. Is that
There's not a dogmatic, let's say, body of received truth that we're saying is absolutely and eternally true and unchanging. But there can be stuff that is absolutely untrue. And there's any number of ways to determine that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it wasn't, their pursuit of truth was, they were highly superstitious as well. You hear these stories about the Greek ships wouldn't sail even at a crucial time of war because they saw the omen of the eagle or something, They really take it extremely serious in terms of like the search for truth, for the more true truth. There's always going to be like that kind of probably superstition and stuff like that, I guess. But what you're suggesting, what you're open to, what you should do is write a book or something. One of us should do, anyways, like utilitarian paganism or something, with a doctrine along the lines of what you're saying, of truth seeking, guided by or inspired by myth or something. How would you put it?
Well, I think of religion as kind of like a deeper, slower form of science. Like, okay, science is concerned with things that are perceptible to an individual during their lifetime, sometimes through artificially enhanced means, like with instruments and whatever. Can't necessarily do the measurement with the naked eye. It's not always intuitive what result you're going to get. You might have to resort to some kind of complex apparatus to get the measurements, but it's fundamentally something that an individual or a group of individuals can probe over the course of their lifetime. Religion is a body of, let's say, traditional wisdom encoded in narrative form, right? And it's stuff that is applicable across the timescale of multiple generations. And so it survives or perishes to the extent that its adherents are able to persist across multiple generations and transmit those narratives and that wisdom across multiple generations. That's the test. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Lindy effect, but basically it states that the likely lifespan of anything is proportional, the likely future lifespan of anything is proportional to how long it has existed already, right? So the Catholic Church would be Lindy because it's existed for over 1,000 years, 1,500 years, something like that. Right. And if we were to try to guess its future lifespan, it would probably be something on the order of how long it has already existed.
Really? Yeah.
That would be the application of the Lindy principle to that example, right? So the longer something has existed, the longer it is likely to exist in the future. That's basically.
That sounds. But I think there's even some potential in the likes of certain groups of Catholics sort of evolving towards a pagan direction. That didn't seem possible before. Maybe, and this is just a personal silly theory of mine, but I can kind of see it, because a lot of them are already only attending church out of kind of traditional habit or something. Their level of literal belief is sort of, it's measurably, it's not super dogmatic or anything, and they would potentially be open to certain changes, and probably are even sort of cringing and wincing at certain things that they hear and see. if it's possible that the church can evolve back towards, it evolved out of a Rome. There's a certain level of Roman tradition in that church that was always there from the pagan times. You can read the Odes of Horus, and he does a mass to Zeus, and it's extremely similar to a Catholic mass.
Well, I'm not saying it has to exist for another 1,500 years.
Right.
Certainly, the Catholic Church is in trouble nowadays. You
Mm.
know, we can observe that the Pope isn't truly Catholic. I mean, that's obvious even to an outsider.
Yeah.
Right. I don't have to be Catholic to say that. But if we were to take a wild guess at how long, let's say, the Catholic Church is going to exist in the future, the best guess would be something on the order of how long it has already existed, because those kind of systems are Lindy. That's the word for it.
It's just old in a Spenglerian sense. Its cycle, or whatever it is its cycle of life and death, is ancient and enormous.
Right. Well, not exactly. No, because
Nope.
I mean, something can have a cycle of life and death. Like an individual human is born, grows old, and it dies, and the lifespan of a human is somewhat short and somewhat fixed. I mean, there's a little bit of variation, but it's not huge, right? Maybe like a factor of 2 in the average life expectancy between, an unhealthy individual and an exceptionally healthy one, right? But other systems are not like that. They don't have that kind of life cycle. A system that is Lindy is one that will tend to exist as long or longer than it has already existed. So the longer it lasts, the longer it's likely to last. It doesn't get old. It doesn't get decrepit.
So even though you see the Pope now, as you just said, is not Catholic and it's in such dire trouble, you figure that's just a temporary setback of some kind.
Well, one explanation is maybe the Catholic Church isn't truly Lindy. Maybe it has reached the end of its life cycle. But my point is just that having survived for as long as it has in the past is indicative of, let's say, the adaptive value of many of its beliefs and practices and teachings. So it wouldn't have made it this far if there wasn't some value.
Yeah. Adaptive value, right.
It wouldn't have made it so far if there wasn't some adaptive value there. And so
okay, adaptive value. How do you square adaptive value with the value of tradition, of maintaining tradition for the sake of genealogical survival? Things like in the church it maintained gender roles and things. Like the strict maintenance of tradition versus adaptive value sounds like your ability to adapt.
Oh,
I guess.
No, actually, there's no conflict there, because when I'm talking about adaptive value, I'm talking about it in the evolutionary sense. Okay. So not the ability to adapt, but the traits that are most adaptive. And something like strict traditional gender roles are more adaptive objectively. This is measurable than like gender fluidity. And there's real underlying reasons for that.
Right.
There are real reasons why it's better to for men to specialize in risk taking and for women to be risk averse. There are real biological reasons for that, because wombs are the bottleneck in reproduction. So if as a society we're taking big risks with women, we're screwing over future generations. We're limiting the ability of the women in society to reproduce by forcing them to take stupid risks that men could be taking instead. Because if men are lost in risky endeavors, then the next generation can bounce back, no problem. But if women are lost, then it has a big impact on the next generation.
Yeah, so and that's even natural, because in those risky endeavors, those that survive really are the innovators and the heroes.
So it is a tradition, and people tend to think of it as like, oh, well, this is just like some dumb thing that we pass down from generation to generation for no reason. But no, there is a reason. Yeah. And you can understand the reason, but that doesn't mean you don't have to respect the tradition.
This is what I feel that we understand, that the average person does not. They simply reject the tradition see it as outdated, unprogressive. And whereas we have sort of at least investigated the reasons why it was beneficial and why it was a good thing, even though it was sort of shrouded in I believe you also have to shroud it in the mysticism, because I don't know what you think about this, because you're a bit more, I wouldn't want to insult you by saying libertarian, but your libertarian roots, I think, are sort of there, in a good way. But that the average person, let's say, requires a silly, superstitious story with a threat to really fall in line generally. Anyways, like say that's why I think the likes of Alex Jones does so well, and why to really capture the mob or the crowd generally, you need a really, crazy, superstitious style story to feed them. You can't just explain things to them the way we are now. They just blank out. And they don't care. You know what I mean?
I think you may be right. And I regard that as unfortunate because I'm a little bit autistic and I don't like to believe things without knowing the reason for them. Or without, thinking that I understand them.
Right.
But maybe that's more of a disability than anything else.
Well, and what I'm saying, you just have to look at it as a science, the science of the mob.
Right.
All right, is what I would say.
And that's what I like about paganism is it's able to accommodate multiple cognitive biases or multiple levels of, let's say, intellectual rigor. You can have, the casual normie, 100 IQ normie. And it's like, oh, okay, well, he's only going to understand it as a narrative and he's only going to understand it as anthropomorphic beings who are, let's say, I mean, there's not really commandments in paganism, but there's definitely rewards and punishments of a sort. It's not like eternal suffering or eternal bliss, but
they had hell and heaven. Like heaven is originally a Saxon word, Heofen and all this. They did have it. And
but there's definitely you can definitely anger the gods or you can win their favor. And so in that sense, there's a causal, anthropomorphic causal kind of element there.
Yeah.
And that's something that a normie can understand. 100 IQ normie can totally understand that. And maybe that's the only way they can understand causality on like a systems level.
I don't think they'll ever care about causality, to be honest. I think they'll just need essentially to be told.
Right.
What was it, Jonathan Bowden, who said they're like sacks of potatoes that you move? I mean, this is we're not making, when you say something like that, you're not making an argument that's appealing to anybody. Well, maybe to someone like you and I, but you have to work. This is the science of the mob. This is what people have mastered that I think, people like us need to study and master and as well and acknowledge. And, it does require, I don't know how much it requires being deceitful or anything, but if you understand the only thing that's going to work on them is appeals to emotion and things like that, then to, conduct yourself in that scientifically, maybe you can view it that way and as a way out in your autism and my Asperger, whatever it is, kind of way that we need to feel that truth is happening and that we're doing a greater good and things like, and we would be. But so
here's an example. One thing I've said before is scientifically, the hypothesis that God or the gods or whoever, whatever anthropomorphic force or deity you choose to refer to, hypothetically, or the hypothesis that the gods lay waste to any society that becomes too sexually permissive and deviant and licentious cannot be falsified.
Cannot be falsified.
No, I mean, it can be falsified. It's falsifiable.
Right.
But it has not been falsified and will not be falsified. And people like you and I, we can understand the causal reasons for that, right? The spread of disease and the lack of stable family relations and all this kind of stuff, lack of intergenerational persistence, all these kind of factors, right? Causal factors. Systematizing, somebody who can systematize can see all these causal, well, not all the causal threads, but enough causal threads to figure out what's going to happen, right?
Right.
But if you just tell the 100 IQ normies, like, hey, look, if you guys turn into a bunch of degenerates, the gods are going to be angry and they're going to lay waste to our society.
And they're dying to be a bunch of degenerates. I mean, they are dying to.
And that is not going to be falsified. That prediction, that hypothesis, that claim is not going to be falsified. It's going to be borne out. Now, we know the causes, or many of them, enough of them. But if you just put it in an anthropomorphic way, you're not going to be wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. So then, we can do that. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, that's correct. And it's strange though, because I mean, in the past you would have scholarly truth seekers who were famous, and didn't seem to be. Although I suppose, like, you think of Plato or and the ancient Greeks generally, I suppose it was only ever really academically famous through history, and even in, say, the Republic, he was talking about a way to organize lesser minds, I suppose. But yeah, this kind of work at your level of examining everything, absolutely everything, to its root level, causal, incentive level, seeking as much truth as you possibly can, understanding that how difficult it is to actually reach a point of agreeable truth, and even then, there's always going to be subjectivity. So that's why you need to be amongst people with a certain similar outlook, and with similar incentives, which would involve similarity between you. What was my point? I'm lost in a bunch of nonsense now. How would we see? This is another thing that most pagans may not like to talk about, is living in the modern technological world. A lot of them are terrified of, the threats of Heidegger and so forth. And a lot of pagans are really, frankly, sort of like hippie agrarian kind of peaceniks, which, that's fine. But I'm more interested in a paganism that is in the now and has a plan with technology and with the future. Hence, we are meant to be talking about imperial space paganism. So how would we go about that? Or what would be, it's not something people equate with paganism, that you would be,
oriented towards the future
and technology.
Yeah. Well, the pagan organization I'm involved with, the AFA, it's not like a revivalist organization in the sense that they're not trying to revive a particular specific pagan practice from a particular period in the past.
Right.
They are looking at all the available sources and trying to draw from those, but they're trying to so they're not reconstructing exactly what was done in the past, but they're trying to revive a pagan practice that's updated for the present. Okay. And oriented towards the future. So, in other words, we don't go to our religious ceremonies in Viking gear or anything like that.
Right.
We wear our Sunday best, so to speak. Modern fashions, and with the idea of dressing up to show respect to your community and to the solemnity of the occasion and everything like that, right? Yeah. So it's a very updated version of paganism. Obviously, looking at the original sources, such as we have, because it's fragmentary, we don't have a complete record. But looking at those sources for inspiration and for guidance, but trying to update a practice and a belief for contemporary times, and with an eye towards the future. So, the founder of the AFA, Stephen McNowlin, and also the high priest currently, Matthew Flavel, have both said, that our destiny is in the stars. So that's where we need to be aiming, and that would be the greatest, glory that we could achieve, basically.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And so, another thing is, we don't totally reject all of the accomplishments of Christianity, because there were many over time, and they came from our people. Christianity was the religion of our people for over 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. So we can't disclaim all of those achievements and all of those accomplishments if we want to be true to our people, if we want to honor our people.
That's good. Yeah. I didn't know they did.
So, looking at something like a Gothic cathedral, right? Mm-hmm. Is a tremendous accomplishment, architectural and artistic accomplishment, and just an irreplaceable treasure. And it's something worth, it's truly awe-inspiring to look at.
It is probably the best architecture that ever existed, I must admit. Yeah.
And it's definitely something worth honoring and worth appreciating for what it is. But, the starships of the future will be our cathedrals. Basically, it's going to be something on the same order of difficulty, actually several orders of magnitude more difficult and costly.
Exactly. This is exactly the point. And this is what I like to do it in this, to do Gothic architecture, to do it in a Roman sense would be to do it for intentionally as difficult as possible, to create an art associated with a practical thing you're doing, say like a spaceship, but to do it in the most difficult, impractical way possible as a challenge, and to sort of show the gods what you can do. So to make a spaceship that was like made of stone, like a Gothic cathedral with thrusters or something.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen. Like the Warhammer aesthetic, I don't think that's going to make it in space, because everything we know of in space that is possible to do is just barely possible to do according to our understanding. So we have to do it in the most efficient way possible.
Well, that's true.
We have to minimize mass. We really have to optimize the shit out of everything in space to do anything. And so our designs are going to be constrained by that. Now, I think there is a worthwhile aesthetic there.
Yeah, I love that aesthetic as well. These like 60s space pop and other aesthetics as well. Yeah, maybe you're right. We can't achieve the Warhammer quite, but I do think I can see down the line once like far down the line, generate like centuries and centuries. When if you're in space, you've got accustomed to it, then you might have an opportunity to you might find people carving an asteroid into like a big Hellenic face in space, or pointless artistic things.
Okay, yeah, no doubt. There will be plenty of room for that. As far as starships go, though, that's going to be something that has to be optimized for basically acceleration to insane velocities using ridiculous amounts of energy that are barely comprehensible currently. We think it's possible. We know it's going to be tremendously expensive. So a cathedral costs on the order of $1 billion to build, a really good one, right?
Right.
Something on the order of $1 billion. And those often took generations to build. They took anywhere from decades to sometimes even centuries to build.
Right.
And many of them were built by towns that only had 5,000 or 10,000 people at the time, because that was a big city in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, they're still working on Gaudi's one, although they fucked it up.
Yeah,
I mean, Gaudi's Cathedral in Barcelona is beautiful on one side, but then they've ran away with another designer for the other side. And it looks stupid, but anyway, sorry.
But and it's interesting studying the financing and the history of those cathedrals, because they were designed to be usable basically in every stage of construction. Yeah. So even starting with just building a dais and an altar, you can have outdoor services there, outdoor religious ceremonies, and then you start to build the cathedral around it, right? And so they were basically designed to be usable in every stage of construction. And that was part of how they maintained the flow of revenue to keep the construction going for generations that it required to finish them. Yeah. And, getting donors and patrons and all this kind of stuff. And then, of course, the tithes that individuals contributed. It was a tremendously complex and long-lasting endeavor to build a cathedral. And it's going to be, scaling for the available technology and the available resources, which are much greater now. It's going to be just as difficult to build starships. Whereas a cathedral is $1 billion investment, a starship is going to be $1 trillion investment at least.
Right.
And
okay, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
What do you think then? I should ask. So, what do you think? I think you're like me in this too, in that you find yourself often, perhaps not as much as me, but defending Elon Musk against hordes of haters, just for the fact alone that he is, seemingly to me anyways, the only one currently doing a good job at creating starships, and with Mars as a goal in mind, like that he cannot be veered from, where NASA is apparently completely useless and does nothing. For that alone, I kind of support him, and I just he's only one guy though, so it's kind of like, what if he dies, or who's going to take it up again? But am I right that you agree that at least in that regard he deserves support?
Yeah, he's definitely worthwhile for that, more than worthwhile, because he does have a positive, optimistic vision of the future. And that's something that's so lacking nowadays, especially among the elitard class, right? They're all obsessed with environmentalist stuff or, overpopulation, quote unquote, or all this kind of bullshit. That's all really misanthropic if you get down to the bottom of it.
Yeah, they appear to be completely hopeless, like just absolutely hopeless. Yeah.
Yeah, they're just extreme pessimists. And, you'll hear things like, oh, humanity is a virus or humanity is a disease, right? Or humanity is a parasite on this earth. And to me, that just betrays the speaker
Nihilism, yeah.
as being that, because that's got to be a case of projection, right? Just because they can only conceive of acquiring resources by parasitic means doesn't mean that those are the only ways to acquire resources, right?
Yeah, they feel guilty.
There are productive ways to produce resources. And that's the point that Elon Musk keeps making over and over again. It's not all zero sum games. It's not all negative sum games. We can play positive sum games. And, I've moved past that Lolbert or classical liberal phase that he's in, but, he's absolutely right about that kind of stuff.
Sometimes I wonder, does he, it's hard to tell with him because yes, he's either definitely in that stage and he does seem in certain regards kind of naive or something. But sometimes I wonder, does he play that up as just to get by, and which would be a very intelligent maneuver to be like, oh, I'm just a goofy kind of centrist guy, don't you know what I mean? Like as a kind of game, since he's in a real crux point between massive forces, and he's
maybe to an extent. I don't think he's super based. I don't think he's like hiding his power level to a very large degree, maybe a little bit. There's nothing about him that, seems very inconsistent with just being like a classical liberal, kind of a centrist, libertarian, classical liberal kind of character. He definitely seems to be in that vein, genuinely in that vein. And, we all know that's not a long-term solution. It's not going to solve any of the underlying problems, whatever. But it does make him a lot more sane and a lot more reasonable than anybody else at his level.
Well, it's a great asset to have. Like, consider all the billionaires in the West and how useless Jeff Bezos, absolute, larval, evil, sinister, wretched creatures, and the richest one is at least he's anti-woke and he's into space, which is the point I was trying to get at. Is again, like I get so tired of the amount of people you meet that not just not into space, but they attack you for it. They're like, that's so stupid. Why would you waste money and time going to space, increasing the biosphere, whatever? I don't understand that view, because that is, to me, an intrinsic nihilism. It's like what you were saying about they betray themselves. It reminds me of a friend of mine. I was talking about years ago. I was talking about going to Mars or something, and he was like, what did he say? He's like, and do what? So we can fuck it up there too. Basically, like we're going to go there and somehow ruin it. And I was like, well, there's nothing there. It's dead. All we could do was bring life there and then fuck it up maybe and kill it. But, even that would be a glorious achievement.
All we can do is make it better, right?
Yeah, there's no other way. So like just the dark nihilist kind of, no, we can't do that. So many people react that way to this. I'm not sure what it is. It's the same kind of reaction to see, I think, to people who sort of hate people for being rich, the communisty kind of youthy, is it envy? Not envy, but I'm not sure what it is. Like I can't even. Can you explain that mindset to me? Because
it's envy and bitterness and greed and all of those things, right? Acquisitiveness. You want what they have, and you're angry at them for having it when you don't, and all this kind of stuff, right? Bitterness.
How does that relate to not wanting to travel to the new frontier?
People who know that they're not capable might have no interest in it. It might just be a sour grapes thing. It's like, if you know that you don't have it together enough, because space is a very unforgiving and dangerous place, right? You have to be really on the ball to survive in space. You have to follow those checklists really well and keep track of a lot of variables.
I think they think the money should be redirected towards their causes, and that they just don't seem to see the point. They seem to think life on Earth, that Earth is somehow boundless in itself. I think they just haven't really considered the limitations of the Earth, maybe, or something. You know,
The Earth is definitely a lot bigger than they are, and that might, I think it represents a lack of vision and a lack of understanding fundamentally. Just a really narrow view of, well, life is just me and my immediate surroundings, right? Not even a global view, but just a much more local view than that. And of course, if you have that kind of narrow local view, going beyond the global, going to the celestial, that's going to seem just like ridiculous, or pie in the sky, or
celestial. That's another whole other problem. I've been writing these science fiction compilation books lately, and I'm always coming up with those science fiction stories. I'm always musing on trying to think myself even about the problem of faster than light travel. And it really does seem, I mean, all the proposed solutions you find in science fiction generally seem pretty hokey for a realist such as yourself. Like, you really think that's possible? I mean, you wouldn't know, I guess, but
I'm not going to say it's impossible. I think for the time being, we need to work on the assumption that we're not going to figure it out anytime soon. Right. So, in other words, we need to start out probably assuming we're going to have to do this slower than light.
So, like a generational ship where you send a colonist out, and okay, there you go, millions of years, breed on your ship.
Well, no, nothing like that. I mean, I think something like 20% light speed is possibly achievable, or 40%.
Oh, what makes you think that? Can I ask? Did you read something about
that? So the best idea I've ever heard is to use light sails.
Okay.
And light sails would be like a very thin, like aluminum foil that's highly reflective. And so you would use the pressure of light to push the ship along. And it just with natural, let's say, sunlight, there's a limit to how fast you can go. And even if you dive down as close as you can to the sun to get, the maximum pressure from the sunlight, within the limitations of what's possible, like you don't want to burn up, you don't want to pull so many G's that you get squished into jelly, right? So there's limits to what you can actually do. But even if you skirt right up to the edge of those limits, you're not going to get a ship using natural sunlight up to even 1% the speed of light.
Right.
Or even a small single digits. But one thing you could do is you could have big solar power stations with giant lasers. Right. And these could push starships out of the solar system. Right. And because the laser is a coherent light, it can focus on that light sail.
Does the power of the laser fade at a distance once it's at the distance?
Yes, it does.
It does, okay.
And so the usable range of the laser is a function of the size of the target and the aperture of the laser, the effective aperture of the lens that's collating this light into a laser beam, right? So you would need insane engineering. You would need, let's say, hundreds of square miles of solar panels driving lasers with apertures of 400 meters or more.
Oh God, it sounds like something.
Pushing these light sails that are tens of kilometers in diameter. So the engineering is all insane, but not fundamentally impossible. And you could maintain enough pressure on these sails for a long enough time, a far enough distance out from the sun, that you could push ships up to 20, 30, 40% the speed of light. And then once they get to their destination, then they have to slow down.
Right.
But there are various means you could employ to create drag to do that. So the interstellar medium is not totally empty. One proposal that's been floated was something called a Bussard ramjet, where you would have like a conical magnetic field that would like funnel these hydrogen ions from deep space into like a fusion engine, and the fusion engine would produce thrust. Well, that was pitched, but people have done the math and they found out that the magnetic funnel would generate more drag than the engine would generate thrust. So that's obviously not going to work for accelerating. But just ditch the engine and you've got a parachute. You've got a magnetic parachute, right? So,
Yeah, right.
So push it out of the solar system. When it gets where it's going, it can use drag to slow down most of the way. And then the light sails can be used to maneuver around the target solar system with, natural sunlight, natural starlight.
And on board the ship, they should have a shrine to Deus.
Yeah.
And maybe Eterna, the goddess of eternity, and the cosmos.
So,
right? And they should pray.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Sorry, I just a little interruption there.
So, in terms of, so it's a one-way trip.
Right.
You're going to be sending colony ships out. It's a one-way trip. They're not going to be able to return because there's no laser to push them back, right?
Right.
Until they develop that star system to the point where they can build lasers. There's not going to be two-way traffic. It's just going to be one-way traffic.
Right.
So, I mean, the question is, what's the profit motive here?
Two-way traffic for millions of years. That's hilarious.
Well, no, not even, because there are star systems, like 4 light years away, 6 light years away, 12 light years away, something on that order.
How long would that take at 20% light?
Like a few decades.
Really? Okay.
20 years, 20 years, 60 years. If you could come up with some kind of like suspended animation, it could be,
Yeah. Or something, or just let them breed.
Yeah.
Space somehow,
you could do it a generational ship, or you could
those funny little quick answers that are inherently kind of pagan and classical that solve certain problems where you wouldn't suggest that to NASA today or anything, but just let them breed.
Well, one objection I've heard to that is, well, but that's unethical. You're not giving them a choice. They're born on this ship. They have this mission to carry out. Like, they don't get to choose. Well, it's like none of us get to choose. Like, we're all fucking born against our will. You just got to fucking deal with it.
Yeah. This is the squeamish modern ethics, the post-Christian ethics, which are the worst. And it's because it's like they actually do the worst things. The things they do are horrendous. Obviously, we can see it in the world around us. But even their scientific innovations are they would object to that. They would object to biologically engineering, a giant eagle or bringing back dinosaurs or something cool. But they'll sit in a lab and grow meat out of proteins, or grow a fetus in a plastic pod or something. These horrific kind of social gimpy things that that aren't related to heroic advancement kind of stuff.
Before the recent war kicked off, Russia was threatening to clone a bunch of Scythian warriors and train them as super soldiers.
Should be done. God, that should be done. They should go into the barrows and the tombs and find the DNA of kings. Yes.
Yeah. And it's great because the ones in the big burial mounds, are going to be the cream of the crop, the absolute elite of Scythian genetic stock, right?
Yeah. Well, they have those here. I go often to the Hill of Tara in Meath. I live in Ireland now, and there's ancient pagan kings in those hills. I don't know where, but it's been so long. I guess would they be able to get any intact DNA? But
the great thing about the ones in Russia is a lot of them are frozen. A lot of them are in permafrost.
Like the mammoths, they found the baby mammoths and stuff.
Yeah, but no, they've dug people up out of those burial mounds that are perfectly preserved, even to the point where they can, photograph their tattoos.
So what needs to be done in an ideal world? Those people need to be cloned, put on a spaceship, maybe grow up in a spaceship, right? Wouldn't that be best?
I'd just settle for bringing them back. It'd be just
that'd be good
to have some of them, running around amongst us. And
we shouldn't hesitate to throw our javelin at the farthest mark, though. When we have if we had your 20% laser plan, we should send them out as well. What better emissary than a Scythian king from?
So as far as the profit motivation, I don't think there's any way to profit from this. There's no way to profit from starships. They're an investment, or maybe an act of devotion, right? It's almost like a religious obligation,
right,
to build them. And I think that's kind of how Elon views them, right? It's something he believes in. something he wants to do for essentially religious reasons. Like, he wouldn't put it in those terms, but that's basically his motivation, right?
There's a really good documentary about him that I saw recently. I don't know. Did you see it? Have you ever watched any of these? I don't remember what it's called. It was on. I don't remember what it was on, but I watched it, and it was very interesting to see his life and his views. Really, everything he does is gearing and planning towards this Mars. He is obsessed with getting people to Mars. His Boring Company tunnel stuff he does, that's really related to tunneling underground on Mars. These employees in his company were saying this stuff, like his his car and solar panel stuff. That's all to do with everything in his mind is planning towards getting people towards Mars. And he sent a Tesla with a little spacesuit in it, just like the heavy metal movie.
Right.
I don't know, where is that at this point? Did it reach Mars yet? I'm not sure.
It's gone past Mars, I'm pretty sure. It's in an orbit. It's in a heliocentric orbit around the sun, but it goes out beyond the orbit of Mars. This is basically it's basically an asteroid at this point.
Oh shit! I thought he was gonna send it to orbit Mars. I was confused on that one. Okay, but I guess you couldn't do that unless you. Well, I don't know what he was up to. I missed that part. But
I mean,
sorry.
Like you were saying earlier, a lot of people just don't get it. They're like, "Well, what's the point?" And then people might have even more specific and concrete objections, but a lot of people just don't get it. They're like, they don't understand why you would want to do it. And
surely they would feel some excitement though, or at a new. I really don't get it. Someone said earlier, Miller Dog One says they have a constant cosmic present, I think, but
I just tune those people out because my point of view.
Most people are like that, and they get angry. They get angry about it. They're like, "Oh, this is so stupid."
My point of view is that someday the universe is going to belong to the people who did get it, or the descendants of people who did get it, right? Who had that, almost religious conviction that this is something we need to do.
It should be part of our religion. It should be part of our religion.
And the people who don't get it, they're an evolutionary dead end. They're going to stay here on Earth. It's an evolutionary cul-de-sac. Someday they're going to get wiped out by the explosion of the sun or whatever. Yeah. And that's it. That'll be the end of it. But the universe will belong to the descendants of the people who got it, the people who believed it, who acted it out.
Okay, so this brings up another point this is something I wanted to ask you about, what you think. I wanted to ask what you think, not in your hopeful heart of hearts, but in your utterly realist, brutal sense. Is we see the meeting point approaching of the likes of Musk and what he's doing and trying to reach Mars, and the sort of accelerating downfall of the West. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it will, what thing will happen first? And if it's the absolute downfall of the West, obviously this dream will be on hold for centuries. What's your opinion about that?
I mean, I don't know exactly what's going to happen there. I do think the West is in serious trouble. I think ultimately we're going to pull out of it to a large extent, but there will be damage, permanent damage, or at least long-term damage that has been done, and that will not be soon reversed. So the question is, how much damage, and will it be able to derail something like Musk's projects? Hopefully there will be. So one thing we know that's going on is dysgenia. Even without immigration or whatever, the native intelligence, average intelligence of Western peoples has been going down since shortly after the Industrial Revolution, right? Historically, there was always a positive correlation between, let's say, intelligence and success and reproductive success.
Yeah.
So the people at the highest levels of the socioeconomic strata, whether they were aristocrats or whether they were successful farmers, the yeoman farmers who were like the more successful commercial oriented farmers versus just the merely subsistence farmers, or whether they were wealthy merchants or whatever, people who were successful in any domain tended to have more children, and more of them survived. And so that was a eugenic force that tended to lift society up over time. The underclasses were, essentially perpetually dying off through less than replacement level
Right.
Fertility, and they were being replaced by downwardly mobile descendants of the middle and upper classes.
Right.
That has not been true for at least 150 years.
Yeah.
In other words, that correlation went from positive to negative, and especially, strongly negative with the introduction of contraceptives. So we've been losing, as a consequence, at least a point of IQ per decade.
Yeah.
And that's going to continue for now. Now, it ultimately is going to halt and probably reversed.
Why do you think
that? Basically the people who don't want to have children are going to weed themselves out of the gene pool. And what's going to end up happening is there's going to be a heritable urge specifically to reproduce, which is something that humans have not needed in their evolutionary history. So we've had proxy urges like the sex drive, but there hasn't necessarily been a strong urge.
How is that a proxy urge? A sex drive? I mean, that's intrinsic to...
Because it's an urge to engage in the act, the reproductive act. But it's not specifically an urge to have a child.
Right. Okay. Right.
So what's going to happen, and there are people who genuinely have biological heritable urges to have children. There are women who are baby crazy, who are just obsessed with babies or having babies, or those are going to be the ones who reproduce.
Right.
Because even with all the opportunities not to reproduce, they're going to be the ones who are still obsessed with doing that. They're going to be the ones populating the future, creating the new generations. Eventually, that's going to become a predominant trait. And then population growth will continue, and eugenic selection hopefully can continue, because there will be a positive correlation between, let's say, how many children you can afford and how many children you actually have.
Okay, but you're talking about, like, say, in a generation when people who have refused to have kids have kind of died off, kind of thing. Is that right?
Well, that hasn't quite happened yet, but it is happening.
Yeah, but matter of fact, you're talking about decades and decades, whereas I see currently an escalating scenario of extremely hopeless leadership and confusion and, like, rampant up is down, just dysgenic decision making.
I don't think that's likely to change within the time scale of decades.
Okay, and with the risk now of even nuclear war and things, you don't.
Yeah. So Dutton, well, I mean, that could definitely change things. I mean, it could just collapse civilization, and then we're back to, like, pre-industrialization.
Well, that's but there goes our dream, like, for maybe
for
forever.
a while, yeah. Maybe forever. So yeah, there's bad shit could happen, or Dutton has some kind of positive longer term takes on this, right? He talks about how, let's say, the leftist elites are also dying out. It's not just leftist rank and file that are not reproducing. It's also leftist elites that are not reproducing. So leftist elites are dying out, and there are a small number of conservative elites. There aren't really any right-wing ones, but you could put Musk maybe into the conservative camp, or at least classically liberal, right?
Yeah.
Which is, there's a lot of overlap between that and conservatives, because America is historically, traditionally a classically liberal nation. So,
yeah.
But there are a lot of, let's say, evangelical Christian conservative entrepreneurs. Not a lot. I mean, relatively, there's still, like, let's say, a single digit percentage of the billionaires, but there are billionaires of that sort, evangelical Christian conservatives who are having 10 or more children. I saw
Musk himself has had, what is it? Like, quite a few.
He's had 9 now, or he still has 9. He's had 10, I think. But he still has 9. And there are, I saw a listicle the other day of 10 billionaires who have more than 9 children. And except for Musk, all of them were, like, evangelical Christian, Trump supporting conservative types. Right. So as the leftist elitards, I don't call them elites, because I feel like that word has too many positive connotations.
Yeah.
I call them elitards. But as the leftist elitards die off along with the leftist rank and file, they, just through sheer refusal to reproduce, there will be a shift back towards conservatism. Now, I think if we want to go farther than conservatism, if we want to go, right wing, truly like reactionary, traditionalist, pre-modern, if you will, not just classically liberal conservatism, then we've still got a lot of work ahead of us. We've got decades of work ahead of us, I think, to precipitate that. I could be wrong. I'm always surprised by how fast the Overton window is moving and how many of our talking points make it into normie conservative circles, like through Tucker Carlson or whatever.
Yeah, he's always watching. That's for sure. He's always watching.
But
yeah, go on, sorry.
But I think we probably have. Well, there is a turn back towards conservatism that's in store within a few decades. And this is something Dutton has talked about probably by the middle or the end of the 21st century.
Anytime I've heard Dutton, it's been fairly hopeless. I remember him saying, we're going to get stupider. No one's going to space. I remember him saying that specifically.
Well, we are going to get stupider because dysgenia is going to continue for all of those decades. Right. And big systems are going to break down. Probably the United States is going to fall apart.
Right.
It might be replaced by a number of successor states. Any kind of big system is going to break down ultimately, because you can't have big systems without trust, without intelligence, without all of these things that are rapidly being eroded and consumed.
Yeah.
So you're going to get, everything's going to fracture. It's going to break apart. Now, does that absolutely guarantee we can't go to space? Hopefully not. Like if the technology improves, and there's two different kinds of technology. Ted Kaczynski made this distinction in his manifesto. There are technologies that can be widely distributed. Like when the Roman Empire collapsed, iron didn't cease to exist as a technology because it could be smelted and worked in every little village, right?
Yeah.
But other things ceased to exist. Aqueducts ceased to exist. Highway systems largely ceased to exist. I mean, the Roman roads remained, but they gradually fell into disrepair and disuse, right? Because these are technologies that require large systems to maintain.
Right.
Iron is not like that. Iron can be widely distributed and produced on a local scale.
Yeah.
So those kind of technologies survived, whereas the large system type technologies didn't. Bronze technology was a large system technology because it was expensive, it was scarce. It was only possible to obtain bronze through international trade, essentially because you had to get copper and tin from widely distant sources.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the Bronze Age and the late Bronze Age collapse, that technology was basically lost. And that was around the time people started switching to iron. That's when that took off. But the bronze, which was the foundation of, let's say, state power and military power through the ability to produce weapons and, kind of monopolize them in centralized military forces due to the scarcity and hassle of obtaining this technology. When chaos and disorder started to arise for various causes, the trade became difficult. There was banditry, there was piracy, and now you couldn't get tin from Afghanistan or Cornwall in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And so that whole bronze based system collapsed and all these civilizations collapsed. So if we do have any kind of collapse, there are certain kinds of technologies that will be lost because they are technologies that require large systems. And it's going to be harder and harder to maintain large systems as the world gets more chaotic, lower trust, as people get dumber, etc. All of these things are going to make it harder and harder to maintain large systems. So the question is,
what are the options for Musk and his business then? If America itself, as you say, is inevitably going to collapse, and every large system is sort of inevitably going to collapse. Like maybe he can dance around the world, use his money to continue his Mars program somehow.
Well, he's making his rockets out of steel, so we've already established that steel is a technology that can be employed and created on a local level.
It's iron and a tiny bit of carbon. Yeah, that's
So I guess the big question mark would be electronics. Like, what kind of electronics can be made on a local level? And right now, it's all like big system type things, because you have these chip fabs that cost billions, tens of billions sometimes, to build these high-end chip fabs that produce the latest generations of chips. And there's actually there's only a handful of companies, less than a handful of companies. There's like 3 companies that produce most of the cutting edge chips in the world.
right.
And that has gone down and down and down over time. So there used to be dozens of companies that were more or less on the cutting edge of microchip technology. And that has gone down and down and down over time because the investments required to create those foundries have gotten so high, so outrageous. So at the moment, actually, the bulk of our most advanced computer chips are coming from one company in Taiwan. And I guess
Taiwan,
yeah,
through stuff that's mined and processed in China.
Obviously. Right. So, I mean, if China takes Taiwan, we're pretty screwed. We're, like we're trying to cut them out of our system now, they're going to no doubt.
A lot of that stuff they could do, I think. And if needs must, I think they could find it in the ground, even in North America. I think, maybe not, but I think a lot of it they could. It's just a matter of like, you will ruin, like you hear about these areas in China where they're processing these metals, and you go, and it's like a blighted wasteland with a lake of acid. And it's this environmental damage that causes more than the actual.
Well, the barrier right now is largely economic. It's not technological. We could do it technologically. The barrier is economic because there's no way to make a return on investment for investing, let's say, $10 billion in building a chip foundry, right, unless you have most of the market. So right, that leaves room for like essentially one player at that level, at the cutting edge level. There are other.
Well, we're talking about the richest guy in the world, first of all, so that's an advantage for anything he needs to do. But yeah.
So at the cutting edge, the highest, the latest generation of microchip technology. So there are other companies that manufacture, trailing edge or and actually that's a problem right now, is sourcing the trailing edge chips. So a lot of like the embedded chips are not cutting edge. They're what's called trailing edge. And so that's older generations of technology.
Okay.
Microchip processes that are 10 or 20 years old,
right,
that are still being produced in legacy foundries that have already been paid off so that they can charge lower prices for these chips, because
this is what you guys are good for, is understanding these power economic reasons that everyone thinks, they'll just, that, but yet these things that really, really, affect things, and you can't.
But the thing is, so one thing that happened as soon as the COVID, like the initial slowdown with the COVID lockdowns and everything, a lot of these legacy foundries that were producing the trailing edge technology actually closed down, like for good.
Oh, they did? Okay.
And then when like demand bounced back because of the stimulus checks or whatever for cars and everything else, they're like, okay, we need a bunch of these chips again. And they're like, oh, sorry, we closed down the foundry. Mm-hmm. So that's where these shortages are coming from, right? That you keep hearing about. So it's not really economical to build a new foundry to produce trailing edge technology, old technology, right? Because it was only possible to sell that trailing edge technology at a discount because the foundry producing it had already been paid off. So if you were to build a new foundry to produce it, it wouldn't be economically competitive with those foundries that are already operating. So, I mean, that's, I guess, ultimately okay if they. But I mean, I guess where I'm going with this is, I don't know, maybe these systems will survive. Maybe the collapse won't be total. Maybe it'll just be a gradual degradation of certain capabilities and organizational structures.
Well, the greater risk probably really is just the establishment itself and its crazy beliefs that
Right.
so they could attempt to take down Musk in the same way they recently did with Kanye or somebody.
But
right?
but my question would be, in the event of a really serious collapse where a lot of systems, a lot of interdependent systems all come down, right? And basically everything gets fucked because there's a lot of critical components that you lose those and you lose the whole process, right? The whole network, the whole system. But assuming that like worst case scenario materializes for whatever reason, whether it's a nuclear war, whether it's just dysgenic decline, what is the level of electronic technology that we could continue to produce on a small scale, on a local scale?
Right.
And it's not zero. It's not nothing.
Yeah.
It would set us back decades at least.
Yeah.
But there might be some level of that technology that we could maintain, even on a small scale, even on a local scale.
There's a few factors I'd say involved in it. I believe that most of it could be done, recreated. I mean, we came up with all that stuff to begin with anyways, right? The whole system of mining and foundry, like we didn't exclusively come up with that, but I mean in the more modern industrial sense we did. And like again, it's sort of a needs must scenario where we're forced to rely on ourselves, then great. We easily could, I would say in less than a few decades, find a solution of some kind, I would say. But then we have the other problem where we are not what we once were, as we're saying, in terms of our own intelligence overall, and we are very much incohesive multicultural society kind of thing, which I shouldn't talk about on YouTube really too much. But that kind of we are not what we once were, and cannot organize in that fashion exclusively to pull back from things like that. So that's like, there's so many factors in the overall decline that if something breaks massively, I can see it being a floodgate thing that just breaks everything. Well,
my interest in space actually predates my interest in politics. Mine too. Quite a bit. Although, I did have that awe, that kind of religious awe with space and the achievements that people had already done in space. And like the science fiction ideas of what else might be possible in space. I've always had that from a young age. And then even when I started to realize how fucked up everything is politically and economically and every other way, one of my first ideas was, maybe we can just go to space and get away from it all, right? We can leave this mess on Earth and go do something new and better on Mars or wherever.
Yeah.
And this was an idea that was common in like Robert Heinlein, because he was also saying, Earth is pretty much fucked. He said it in Starship Troopers in 1959, right? So he was way ahead of the curve,
right?
With all of this stuff. But he was like, the space thing is a real opportunity. And he thought he had this very American idea that the frontier is the place to be. And that's where all the energy and the vitality is.
I agree.
Settled societies become stagnant and decadent and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have this frontier that expands outward of like vital, energetic, growing civilization. And then everything behind it is going to be just like degeneracy and decadence and collapse and decay, right? The core of human civilization.
I believe like him, once you force the frontier, actually the at home becomes improved as well, because they know there's a further thing that they can look up to. Basically it's a matter of like looking upwards, always striving. It's the really, I think, Greek ideal contained in all their philosophy and everything they bequeathed Western civilization was.
I don't totally agree with I don't totally agree with Heinlein anymore. I think we have to sort out the problems. We have to find long-term solutions to the problems we have on Earth and on any planet that we settle. We have to be able to create stable, long-term, durable civilizations, right? Mature civilizations.
Yeah, but you can never fully plan things, and things will always take a twist and a turn. That if there's one thing I know about evolution, is it will surprise you. You will never be able to guess the way things it'll throw at you.
And maybe there's always going to be the civilizational cycle, right? The rise and fall. Maybe there's just no way around that.
Yeah.
But
I agree with Heinlein that if you're pushing and you're being radical and you're taking risks and you're taking big adventures, it just improves everything overall, at home and abroad. And to turn away from that is a big mistake.
I don't think it's an escape, though, because I don't think we can push the fringe out unless we have a stable center. So I do think we have to address the problems at home in order to push this frontier out. So now, whereas at first I started thinking of space as like somewhere to escape the clown world. We weren't calling it that back then, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, whatever.
A new world where we can escape the clown world stuff and, do something new, do something better, right? Build a new city on a hill to show them the way back home, all these crazy misguided people. But now I think of it more as like space is the feather in the cap for figuring out all of these issues and solving all of these problems. Once we do that, and only if we do that, will we be able to push our frontier outward, because we need a settled, established, mature civilization in order to do that. You can't build a fully self-sufficient, self-sustaining, let's say, colony on Mars unless it has an Earth to trade with, a civilization on Earth, a functional, established, durable civilization to supply it with things and also to purchase things that it supplies. Maybe at a certain point, centuries down the road, once the population is to a certain level and the economy has built up to a certain level of sophistication, maybe then Mars can be largely independent, but it's going to take at least centuries to get to that point. Right.
And what do you think of the plan to nuke the poles? Is that ever possible? Do you think that's possible? To create an atmosphere?
It's possible. I don't know how much actual good it would do. I think there are more subtle ways of accomplishing the same ends.
Right.
But the terraforming thing is always going to be like a really long-term project. That's maybe thousands of years in the future. If we're talking about having a breathable atmosphere on Mars where you can walk around on the surface without protective gear, that's probably thousands of years in the future. It's going to be a long-term project. In the short term, we're going to have to colonize Mars as it is.
Well, that's the big thing in our own lifetime, I think.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that these people don't understand, the people that attack us over this, that say you and I would be writing on and looking at, is that hopefully, I think Musk has a plan to send somebody to Mars. I forget the date. I looked it up recently.
He wants to be there by the end of this decade, basically.
Is it basically okay? Like, whether or not he does that, but I mean, a lot is riding on that. If he succeeds at that, that will completely wake up and change the dynamic. I think here, like that will divert a lot of people away from their sort of incestuous or their inward self-immolation, self-devouring stuff they're doing. It'll kind of, I believe if he succeeded at that, it would change a lot of things. It would if he can manage to do that before things collapse or they tear him apart and take away all his money because he makes the wrong tweet or something. I think that's our only hope of like getting ahead of the dark age, I think.
Have you, well, it's certainly something that can serve to focus and unlock a lot of energy, right? A lot of enthusiasm. Yeah. And we saw that with the space race back in the 1960s. We're seeing it now. I don't know if it's to the same extent, but we are seeing that, that enthusiasm starting to bubble up and people getting excited, some people getting excited at least, about what's going on now. And I've talked to a lot of people, some of them just don't get it, but a lot of people genuinely are excited about this. And not just people in our circles, but throughout society in all sorts of different kinds of circles.
Some are, yeah.
Some are.
I'd like to know, I'd love to see a poll and know how many people are for it and how many people are like indifferent and how many people are the ones that get angry about it.
Well, have you ever heard the song Whitey on the Moon?
No, what's that?
It was a song that came out after the Apollo landings.
Right.
And it was like this guy, like basically complaining sarcastically about all the money that was being spent on this. He's like, well, a rat bit my sister Nell and I can't pay my rent and all this kind of stuff.
Personal problems. Yeah.
And he's like, all these little tiny like mundane problems, and he's like, but it's all okay because Whitey's on the moon.
Oh,
So he's like
that's so
sarcastically
petty.
like,
Oh my God. That's so petty.
why can't you throw some of that my way?
See, but I bet sadly, once again, this is the problem, the mob problem. A great deal of them are probably of that mindset.
Yeah, no doubt.
Maybe most.
And
probably most.
What's hilarious is, okay, so space is inherently a meritocratic undertaking.
And it's inherently aristocratic in certain ways.
It's inherently meritocratic and inherently aristocratic because really only the best of the best can participate.
Yeah.
You're going to have a huge society, and even if it's even if you have a high average IQ and all this kind of stuff, the expense and the difficulty are going to be such that only a tiny percentage of your society can actively participate in, let's say, the exploration or the colonization of space. So it's inherently meritocratic and aristocratic. But NASA is trying to do it now in an egalitarian way. So they're trying to impose quotas.
But what have they done? What have they done at all for like decades? Have they done anything compared to what Musk has done in like a?
Well, yeah. There's no comparison really, in terms of at least in terms of manned space flight. There's no comparison. NASA has done some interesting space probes and whatnot. They continue to do that, but the pace of those, they're only launching one every couple of years and blah blah blah. So it's not. The pace and the scale of it is not super impressive, although a lot of the individual missions are pretty impressive. So, but in terms of like the human space flight, Musk has accomplished so much more in the last 2 decades than NASA has on a tiny fraction of the resources. Most of which actually came from NASA, which is one thing he gets a lot of shit about, especially from like the libertarian types. They're like, oh, he's just a welfare whore feeding at the trough. And it's like, okay, but the trough exists and somebody's going to feed at it. And it's either going to be these legacy contractors who cost way more and provide way less, or it's going to be Musk who gets a share of the money to do what he wants, but also actually provides a lot more value to NASA.
And that is so once again, and that is once again so petty. It's so like, irregardless of what he's achieving and what it means for all of us, kind of thing. They wanted to tear him down because of how he did it. I wouldn't give a shit if he exploited NASA, or, as long as he gets someone to Mars, that would be the main thing for me.
Right. I mean, that money is either going to be totally wasted, or a part of it is going to go to Musk to do something actually cool. I would rather the latter.
Yeah, if you watch the documentary and stuff, like he's definitely not like he definitely works all the time and is committed to his little beliefs and stuff. Like he took a risk on that when he was doing the SpaceX. It shows how many times the rockets failed. I think there was like, was it 4 in a row? Each rocket, like, a genuine rocket attempt. I don't know how many millions were in each one. There must have been, I think there was 4 in a row that failed, and he just kept gambling on it until he got, and like figuring out what little tiny thing went wrong each time until he solved it, So he was dedicated and took a big risk. Like his entire fortune was on the line there as well, as it was with the cars, the Tesla thing as well. So, he's definitely some kind of idealist in that sense. I don't mean to be always like, I don't want to sound like his number one fan. I mean, I am obviously a fan. I can't deny. I'm a fan of what he's doing, I suppose. But I understand the criticism. Most people get angry because of his chip in the brain thing he said. But even that, I think, is his naive kind of science fiction. He thinks you can put he thinks about people. He wants people to be able to compete with AI or something, and be able to download things into their brain instantly or something like that. But most people think, oh, the government's going to control me through this, and criticize him for that.
Well, a lot of people think that AI is on the verge of replacing us, and the machines are going to wake up and just have no use for us and all this kind of stuff. I think that's a lot more remote of a possibility, both in time and probability, than most people suppose.
Right.
And if you just look at how hard it's been for them to master something fairly narrow, like self-driving cars, right? That's a very specific.
Yeah.
It's a very specific and narrowly defined task.
Yeah.
but they still haven't got it to the point where it's actually market ready, in the sense that, you know, they've always been pitching like, oh, this thing will be able to drive you around. And no, you got to sit there and keep your hands on the wheel. Right. And all these kind of things. And it's not certified to literally chauffeur you around, and it won't be for a while. And they've been working on it for over a decade, saying, oh, it's right around the corner, just a couple more years.
Yeah.
But the difficulty that they've had with this, I don't, you know, I think AI is going to be a bigger and bigger thing, and it's going to be more and more disruptive in good ways and bad. I'm not necessarily downplaying the risks, but I just don't think it's going to be as big, as quick as a lot of people suppose. And that's a good thing, because it gives us time to adjust and update and, you know, figure out what limits we need to set, because there are limits that we're going to need to set. I mean, I'm agnostic. I don't know that it's going to be a permanent thing, or whether we're going to have like a full-scale Butlerian jihad to prohibit it categorically. So I'm pretty undecided yet where things are going to lead, but I don't think it's going to lead anywhere as bad, as quick as a lot of people, or as good as quick, depending on how they're looking at it, as a lot of people think.
So what you just said there, the Butlerian jihad, now that reminds me that this is where everything we've discussed must converge in that, and that would be the most difficult part of our entire mission, would be to inject in everything we're talking about in terms of space and our hopes with space exploration, inject the pagan part and the imperial part, where there's where you're intentionally aiming to, I mean, that's much farther down the road, when the possibilities of that, I mean, that's very romantic and almost silly of us to presume, but I do think it is in the cards, that in the discarding of democracy over time, and certain realizations, and maybe it would be entirely necessary to have that prerequisite to successfully be a expanding biosphere. It's at least a solar empire of some kind. You would have the needs of religion as understood, as you were explaining, empirically through paganism, as well as a somewhat undemocratic imperial view politically. And how could we?
Well, absolutely. It can't. It at least can't be egalitarian, universal franchise democracy.
No.
Maybe you could have some kind of aristocratic democracy that would function for a long period of time, but you certainly can't have egalitarian, universal franchise democracy and have nice things of any kind, whether in space or on Earth.
And that's going to be sad, because when they do begin the Mars colony, but these things will probably evolve out of even liberalism, potentially. When hard reality really cuts in, say when you're in your Mars colony and you're trying to survive, you know what I mean? Like, that's when reality really intrudes on your nice ideas. So even though they've sent, 5 lesbians and 2 Muslims to Mars, they'll find their way back to natural values through necessity while they're there.
Well, there's going to be different colonies, I'm sure. There's going to be more than one colony with more than one orientation, with more than one mission. If NASA is still around, they're not going to be able to get to Mars on their own. They're just not able at this point. They're too egalitarian. They're too ideological.
Yeah,
they don't have the ability to get there on their own. But if somebody like Musk does it and NASA is still around, they'll probably buy tickets on his ships and set up their own colonies. So you'll have a diverse spectrum of colonies that are set up, and then the results will show which ones work and which ones don't.
Yeah, exactly.
There's not going to be any way to explain it away.
Results, exactly. Exactly, yeah. What was I going to say there? I knew it was over for NASA when they started. For a while there, this is like, I don't know, this must be 10 or more years ago, but one of their main selling points about themselves was that they invented Teflon and stuff like this. And it was like, to appeal in the petty normie way, you have to talk about Teflon and their convenience item that they have in their homes, versus the fact that they went to the moon, for God's sake, But we made Teflon is more important, more exciting. I had a feeling then that they were succumbing to that kind of egalitarian consumerist worldview of pettiness, and the heroic thing they'd already done was somehow lesser to this convenience item they created. I knew that some kind of threshold had been crossed, or I felt. And yes, they've been worthless ever since. They seem to do nothing.
And they've been getting more and more worthless. Yeah. You know, even back under the Trump administration, so they have this program called the Artemis program, which is supposed to be the successor to the Apollo program, you know, to get America back to the moon.
Right.
And even under the Trump administration, their mission goal for the Artemis program was to land the next American astronaut and the first female astronaut on the moon. So they were already including a woman astronaut as a mission goal. And then, of course, when Biden gets in, he has to one-up that.
Oh, God.
And be like, we're going to have a woman astronaut and an astronaut of color.
Oh.
And there's only supposed to be 2 astronauts on the first mission.
In the end, they're going to send like 3 transvestites or something. And they're like, you know, they'll open the airlock on the first day or something, and it'll be.
And this is literally all of their messaging now, is this kind of intersectional quota filling. That's all their publicity material. I watched a video about the Mars lander they just did a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And this was like their big promotional video for this mission, explaining what this mission was all about and like what an accomplishment it was and everything. Not one single person they talked to in the entire video was a white male.
Right.
And I was like, what are the odds?
What are the odds of the white male that were involved in every step of the process along the way up to that point, up until and
it must have been the only explanation, the only plausible explanation is they made a conscious ideological choice not to feature any white males in this little publicity video.
You know what I think is even worse is that the first, and this is because it's like a landmark thing. The first song played on Mars by the rover, it could have been, you know, Beethoven, Mozart, something really, you know, significant, signifying something. It was fucking this guy who's even forgotten now. What's his name? Will I Am or something from the Black Eyed Peas, some fatty group from like at the time that no one even remembers. That was the first song played on Mars, the first music played on Mars. I was like, oh, that's so.
Well, it actually goes back a lot longer than that, because if you look at the Voyager mission from the 1970s, they sent a record.
Yeah, I don't mind that. Yeah, and it has
a bunch of audio tracks.
Yeah, Johnny Be Good and stuff. I don't mind that. That's okay. It's better than fucking
Black Eyed. But if you look at, so they invited countries from all over the world to submit audio tracks for that record.
Okay.
If you look at like the Soviet ones and the East German ones, it's like the East German ones are like the East German ones are like you know, German classical composers, you know, like Beethoven and Mozart, right? And the Soviet ones are like Russian classical composers, like, you know, Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff and all this kind of stuff.
Rimsky-Korsakov, excellent, yeah.
Right. And the American ones are like jazz, rock and roll. It's like some alien's going to find this fucking probe and they're going to assume like the Soviet Union and East Germany were like the dominant civilization on our planet at that time.
Well, maybe if they sent the right rock and roll, I could, you know, I have a weakness for a lot of that, to be honest. But yes, you're right. But Eli, I think I better wrap it up. I didn't realize the time, and I actually do have to go. So
okay.
I think we touched on the topic fairly well. I mean, there's more could be said, but I'm sure we could carry on. But I do have to go. So thanks for that.
Okay, sounds good. Pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much for doing that. And like, I'm happily have you on anytime. If you have anything you want to get off your chest, you just let me know.
All right. Yeah, we'll do it again sometime.
For sure. But I got to go for now. So thanks for that. And we'll talk to you later. Goodbye.
All right. Goodbye.
Goodbye.